Great. All right, Lucy, I might introduce you to all of you to this session. Welcome and thank you very much for coming from across Australia. It's wonderful to be able to reach so many of you. We're very lucky today to have Lucy Dickens here with us to talk to you. As you can see, the boot camp that we are going to experience over the next hour and a half. Where Lucy's going to tell you everything you ever wanted to know about working in a law firm, but were too afraid to ask. So just by way of introduction, if you haven't already seen some information about Lucy, Lucy Dickens is a lawyer here in Perth, Western Australia, and she's a business coach with over a decade of experience in law firm transformation. And she helps sole practitioners and leaders of boutique law firms to design and package and systemize their delivery of their services so they can eliminate the grunt work and spend more time on things they love. And she really practices what she preaches. Her practical experience extends across all areas of legal practice management, but she has a particular knack for leading teams and designing streamlined processes that drive efficiencies and deliver value. Lucy hosts the Doing Law Differently podcast. I encourage you to view those, where she interviews leaders in law who are reinventing legal practice. Lucy is also a senior associate at a firm, Berman and Ryde, which is a leading new law firm in Perth, Western Australia, where she leads the development of the Perth's firm's consumer legal services and brings together people, technology, and processes to design and deliver innovative legal services. Welcome, Lucy, and thank you for coming along today.
Thank you. All right, let's jump in and get started. So whether it's your first experience in a 9-to-5 grad role or your first real job in a law firm, either way, your first day is new territory and it can be really daunting. In today's world, there are lots of opportunities to take your career in many different directions, but we all have to start somewhere. Everybody has a day one. So whether it is your first job or it's perhaps your work experience placement or it might be a grad position, you might start when you get the job feeling a little bit like this. Or perhaps you feel like this because it's quite exciting, right? But when you start and you get in and you're a few days in, you might start to find yourself feeling perhaps a bit like this, or maybe like this. And I hope it's not like this. But what I can almost guarantee is that you will have questions that you want to know the answer to, but you don't know how to ask, or maybe you just don't know who to ask. Whether you feel embarrassed or whether you feel worried that really you should know the answer, and is this a silly question? Should I be asking or not? There's a lot that we don't know if you've never stepped inside a law firm before and it's your first day. So it's those questions that we are going to tackle today. In Bootcamp, everything you ever wanted to know about working in a law firm but were too afraid to ask. And as well as answering the questions that you want to know, I've also designed this session to give you all of the information, or at least a lot of the information, that we as your supervisors want you to know. So there might be slightly different takes on the same question, but I'm going to answer the things you want to know and tell you the things I want you to know. Now, before we dive in, Michelle has given you an introduction to me, but let me tell you a little bit more about who I am. So as Michelle said, I'm a senior associate at Perth law firm Berman and Ryde, where my practice area is in estate planning and deceased estates. But I spend most of my time not on the practice of law, but on business development, technology, and training and supervising. I am a business coach for forward-thinking law firms. I really like to work with owners of small law firms who want to simplify their business to have more time for the things that they enjoy. I'm the author of an upcoming book called Doing Law Differently that will be published later this year. And as Michelle mentioned, I host the Doing Law Differently podcast. In the podcast, I really like to look at how the world's most progressive law firms are shaking up the legal industry, trying something new and doing law differently. I interview leaders in law and I take a really practical look at law from the inside. So I'm really interested in the behind the scenes look at what does a law firm look like and how do you operate things in your law firm? How are you challenging the traditional way that law is practiced? And those are the types of questions that I ask. So if you're interested in the future of law and you're interested to get some feel for the behind the scenes of law firms, then have a look at the podcast. You can find it anywhere where you might listen to your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or just on my website. These are some examples of some recent episodes that I have published. I recently shared reflections from my 10 years of doing law differently, which you might be interested in at the start of your career to kind of get a feel for how my career has played out so far, along with some other examples here around pricing, in-house, and new ways of working, things like process design. They're just some examples, but I wanted to give you a feel for the kinds of things we look at, because I think that as law grads and as law students, you will be really interested to get a feel for what it looks like in different types of firms. And that's exactly what the podcast is all about. So that's a bit about me today, but not so long ago, I was just like you, just getting started with my career in law. So how did I get here where I am? This picture is me when I was admitted. This was on just after my admission to the Supreme Court in Western Australia. The idea of boot camp came from my first day at the law firm Birmingham Ride, where I work today. I started as an undergraduate. I had a part-time position at the law firm and I worked there part-time during semester and full-time during uni break. And day one of my job was called Bootcamp, and it was dedicated to training and teaching us the kinds of things that we're going to look at today. Part of me, I'll admit, thought that it was a little bit basic. I thought, why are you teaching me how to introduce myself to a client? But then when I actually got shoved in front of a client, I thought, thank goodness somebody had told me actually what I need to do when I get there. Because we all think we might know how to act, but it's actually quite a different thing when you're put in the position. So Bootcamp started from my first day at the law firm, and I have adapted the concepts to add some stories from my own experience and also from other supervisors and partners who work with people just like yourselves. I run our law firm cadetship program, which employs law students, so just where I started when I started in the firm. And I'm also responsible for hiring, interviewing, training all of our junior lawyers and law grads. So a massive part of my role is this training and mentoring and supervision of junior staff. I have read thousands of job applications and interviewed hundreds of candidates for positions at our firm, and I have been the supervisor of many, many people's first job in law. So I know how you're feeling, and like I said, I've been there too, so I get it, right? And this picture was me at the start of this year when I was interviewing for a junior lawyer position. I'd not long before had a baby, so he came along to the interview. But this was the flip side. And you can see that we're there as the interviewers and we're smiling, we're happy. So try and maybe let that quell your nerves if you're feeling a bit anxious. The point is that I have been where you are, and I've spent most of my career coaching and mentoring people just like you to help them find their feet in lawland. So why am I sharing this? Why Bootcamp? Well, there are a few reasons. The first is to answer the questions that you're afraid to ask. And hopefully I'm going to touch on a lot of them during the presentation, but we've also got a really big chunk of time for questions at the end, and you can ask your questions publicly or anonymously if there are things that I haven't covered, and this is your opportunity to ask the questions that you have been afraid to ask. I also hope to help you manage your anxiety. I know how nerve-wracking starting your career in law can be. So by giving you some of the skills and telling you some of the things that you need to know about what to expect, I'm hoping by doing that I can help manage your anxiety. Teach you some of the things that you'll be expected to know, and that will help to reduce the tension between you and your future supervisors and to set you up for success with your career. Importantly, I want you to start where you are Allow yourself to be a beginner because nobody starts off being excellent. It's okay to have questions, and here today is an opportunity for you to ask them. So in today's session, this is what it's going to look like. I have a framework which is 7 categories of things that you want or need to know about life as a junior in a law firm. I also have a set of top tips, just quick, sharp takeaway points for you that I have collated both from myself and from other supervisors and partners in the law who I've asked for their comments on this session. And I'm going to save lots of time for questions at the end. Michelle will help to facilitate that for us at the end, but I will ask you to save them to the end. I mean, if you want to type them in as we go, that's fine, so that you don't forget them, but I'm going to tackle them all at the end.
Sorry to interrupt, Lucy. I've just had a message that somebody doesn't have audio.
Okay. Can others hear us?
Yeah, that's what I just need to check. Could you just let us know if you can hear okay, everybody? Yes. Okay.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Great. Jasmine, it might be something that you are having an issue with. Sorry to interrupt, Lucy.
That's okay, no problem. Thanks everyone for your comments, that's good. So I'm happy for you to type your questions in as we go if you want, if it's going to help you to remember them or jot them down, and then I'll come and look through them all at the end. We've got an hour and a half and there's a lot of you on the call and a lot of content to go through. So let's get started. And I think it makes sense to start at the start, which is with your job application. How do I stand out from the crowd? Well, the good news answer to this question is that it's actually really easy, and probably much, much easier than you think. I have read hundreds of job applications for part-time undergraduate positions, for graduate positions, and even for more senior lawyers. And there is one thing, just one thing that you need to do that will make your application stand out from the crowd. And that is to apply for the job. Now that sounds simple, but what I mean is apply for the job. Apply for the job that you're applying for. Address the selection criteria. Talk to the selection criteria. Talk to the job description in your application. In a pile of hundreds of applications, it's really, really easy to spot the people who have put effort in versus those who have just pressed submit on their preloaded cover letter and resume that they've already got in Seek or in Career Hub or wherever it might be that you've got your application information saved. For me, when I'm reading the applications, if I can see that somebody has literally just pressed submit and hasn't actually put any thought into the job that I am advertising, they're going to go straight to the bottom of my pile. Now, it's not to say that I won't read your application, because I will, but I'm not going to read it first. I'm going to give priority to the people who I can see have clearly put effort in applying for the job that I am advertising. Now, look, I'm not just talking about obvious errors. You know, I have had people send me an application where they've just made a slight error, like they've forgotten to change my firm name and they've kept in the name of the previous job that they applied for, previous firm where they applied. But I can see that they've put some effort into actually talking to my job. I'm not going to mark you down for that. We all make those type of mistakes. But where your application has nothing to do with the job that I'm advertising, or where you're telling me in your application that my career goal is to be a family lawyer, but you're applying for my job that is in criminal law, it's pretty clear to me that you haven't spent time or effort applying for my job. And so I'm not really going to want to spend a whole lot of time and effort myself in reviewing your application. So the one thing that you can do to stand out from the crowd is put some effort into your applications. Apply for the job that is advertised. And when you do that, tailor your resume, tailor your cover letter, address it to the right person, and address the selection criteria. As part of that, I want you to sell yourself. Now, this is tricky because I know when you're writing your resume and you're writing your application, this is about you, right? This is your place to showcase who you are. But I want you to try and shift your perspective and think less about what it is that you want out of the job and more about what you can give. What is it that you've got to offer, and what can you bring to the job? What can you bring to the firm? What experience do you have that you can contribute? It's hard to kind of hear this, I think, and it takes you a while, I find, until you've got started in your career to really understand it. But when we enter a law firm as a junior, we come out of law school, we've just finished our PLT, or perhaps we've got a work experience placement, and we think that we can contribute all these skills and knowledge that we've learned from university, and we can, but the truth is we're often more of a liability. The firm who employs you has to spend a lot of time and resources in training you and getting you up to speed to make you a useful resource within that firm. So the more you can sell yourself in the interview and tell them what you have to offer, not just what you want to get, the more you're going to demonstrate that you understand that, and you're going to put yourself ahead of the game. Okay, so once you've got your brilliant application that applies for the job and that sells yourself, we then get to the interview. So my tips for the interview are firstly to research the firm. Find out what you can about them before you show up. At the very, very least, you should have had a very good look at their website and have an understanding of who they are and what they do. Know who you're going to be interviewed by and read their bios and look at their LinkedIn profiles, see what you can find out about them. Dress appropriately and err on the side of caution here. I'm going to talk more about how to dress in a minute, and the same principles apply to your interview and to what you should wear on day one. But dress appropriately. One interviewee, probably about 6 months ago, showed up late to her interview. She had a giant cup of takeaway coffee in her hand and her mobile phone in the other. Now, I have nothing against coffee. I'm a big fan of coffee, but it's not really appropriate to come into your interview for a professional position with your coffee here and your phone here, and she didn't put them down. She held them for the whole interview. And I wasn't sure what was more important to her at that point, whether it was the coffee, her phone, don't know what was going on there, or the interview. And it definitely didn't seem like we were the priority. So please don't do that. Put your phone in your bag, put your phone in your pocket, switch it off. You can have it off for half an hour or so while you're in there having the meeting, and give the interviewees your full attention. Remember that you're interviewing them just as much as they are you. So go prepared with your own questions. And when you're answering the questions that they have of you, be honest. I recently interviewed a candidate for a position and we wanted to offer her the job. She was the winner as far as we were concerned. But we needed to do a reference check because there was something that just wasn't quite sitting right. She told us that she'd left her previous position because there wasn't enough work for her. But when we did the reference check, and when I did some searching online, I found that her firm was actually advertising to replace her position. And it turned out that the reason why she had left her previous employment was because of a personality clash with some of the others at the firm. And look, that wouldn't have been a problem to me because we don't all get on with everybody and we can't all be expected to get on with everybody. So if she'd have told us that the reason why she left is because she didn't get on well with the people at the firm, she would have got the position. But she didn't. She told us something else, and she told us something that wasn't true, and that cost her the job. And that was really disappointing for us because we wanted to hire her, and I can tell you the personality clash thing would not have been a reason for us to not offer the job. The reason was that she wasn't honest in the interview with us. So be honest. Be respectful, be engaged, and share what you have to offer. Inside a law firm, what happens when you get inside the door? Where do you fit in the hierarchy? I know that's a question that a lot of students and grads have. Where do I sit here, and who kind of is above me, if you like, and where do I fit? So let's have a look. This is an example of a traditional law firm hierarchy. So you've got the equity partners who are in charge. They're the business owners and they're running the show. You've got partners, senior associates, lawyers, graduate lawyers, law clerks, paralegals, and legal secretaries. Now, this is just an example of a hierarchy, but you can see that there's a pretty clear pyramid structure. So the equity partner will have partners who work underneath them, and they will then be responsible for senior associates and lawyers. And you can see in this side over here how that might look. So you're going to fit somewhere there on the hierarchy, and bear in mind that there's not necessarily a one size fits all. But your firm that you are employed by might look more like this. In many more modern or new law firms, there is no real strict pyramid hierarchy, and they have much more of a flat structure. And so the hierarchy might look a bit more like this, where we have responsibility going both ways. Now, I don't know what the position's going to be in the firm that you first start off with, and you probably have lots of questions about what that will be. And I'm going to save most of those for the Q&A. But the point I wanted to make about inside the law firm and about the hierarchy is that you need to respect everybody. There might be a strict hierarchy, and there might be a really clear career ladder as to how you can progress in your career, but you need to have respect for everyone. A former secretary in my firm used to make notes about people's phone manner with them when she'd call them to book in for their interview. And I would sometimes make those calls, and still do sometimes make those calls if I want to arrange an interview with somebody. And quite often I notice a really big shift in a person's mannerisms with me when they realise that I'm the person who's actually going to be interviewing and supervising them, versus when they think that I am a secretary who's calling to make the appointment. Everybody needs to be treated with respect. And often I have heard that law firms will make an offer based on how you treat their receptionist, their secretary, their support staff. Everybody in the firm is important, just as important as you, and deserves as much respect as everybody else. And even it's important to recognise that often the secretaries or the law clerks who have been with a firm for years could end up being really, really helpful to you, because they have a lot of knowledge about how things work and how things operate. So make sure that you treat them with respect. Now, let's move on to number 3, which is your role. So like I said when I started, going into a law firm can really be quite daunting. I remember on my first day at the firm wondering whether I should take my own lunch, or if people would bring lunch, or whether they would buy lunch, and would I be the odd one out, and do we have lunch together, and when do I eat my lunch? And it sounds so silly because this is a question about lunch, but I know from speaking to lots of law students and law grads that that is a question that a lot of people actually have before they go in on day one, and they don't know the answer to, should I bring my own lunch? So there are lots of those types of questions that will be on your mind as you start this new journey. Let's unpack your role and how do you make yourself useful? Bearing in mind what I said at the beginning about the fact that when you start out in a new firm, you're a cost to the firm. So you want to be really proactive about making yourself as useful as you can be as quickly as possible. And that's really going to stand you in good stead. So let's start with the number 1 rule in any law firm. And that is to take a pad and a pen everywhere you go. Your number 1 job as the junior employee, in fact, as any legal practitioner, your number 1 job is to be the note taker, the scribe, or the document keeper, and write everything down. Don't go anywhere without a paper and a pen, and you'll know that this is drummed into me so much that I don't expect to write anything during this session, but I've got my notepad ready to go just in case I do. Everywhere you go. So if somebody says to you, Lucy, can I have a quick chat? Your response is, yes, let me just get my file note. You want to take it everywhere you go. You could have the best memory in the world, but you still need to write everything down. File notes aren't just for your memory, they're for record keeping, they're for risk management, they're for records for other staff. They are really, really important. So what makes a good file note? Well, for a start, you need to have the date and the matter reference number, or some other description of the file, however your files are categorized in your firm. Always include the time of the meeting and the duration, and that's especially important if you're working at a firm that requires you to record and keep a timesheet. Always need the names of the attendees, and that's both staff and clients. So if you've got 3 or 4 staff members there, then you need to record who is in the meeting as well as the clients that are there too. And a top tip for that when you start out in a new firm, if you're like me and you have terrible memory with names, I really struggle to remember people's names. When I first started, drew a map of the office, and it's a small office, so this was relatively easy for me to do. And I drew a really rough map of what it looked like and where everybody's desks were, and I wrote their names on the desks on my map. And any time before I was about to go and speak to someone, I'd get my little map out and I'd check what their name was, and then I'd walk over and I would have magically remembered. You might not be able to do that if you're in a massive firm, but you can do it at least for your division. Always names, really important. It's embarrassing if you have to ask for somebody's name who you've been working alongside for 2 or 3 weeks now and you've just forgotten. So there's a little tip for you. So back to your file note, obviously you need a subject. Note form is okay on your file note, but it needs to be enough detail that somebody else can understand it. I have a lawyer in my firm who's in this habit of writing letters that represent words and nobody else knows what they mean. So there'll be like an IDKLM, and that has some random meaning to her that nobody else can interpret, and that's not okay. Other people need to be able to understand your file note. So your handwriting needs to be good enough. Your note form is fine, but as long as other people can understand it. And make sure that on your file note, you record any instructions as well as advice that's been given. So really what you're after is a record of the conversation. Make sure that they get scanned and saved to the file if the files are electronic, or filed away in the physical file if the file is a paper file. That's really important because a file note is no good to anybody if it hasn't been stored. So file note, that's the number one thing that you should know about your role in a firm. How to conduct yourself. Just have a quick look at the chat. Okay, yeah, I'll keep going and I'll save those for afterwards. Okay, so what to wear. This comes up a lot in terms of what to wear, and look, I'm not going to pretend that I get to decide the dress code for every law firm in the country, because I definitely don't, and there will be slight differences between firms depending on the kind of work you're doing and the kind of clients you're working with, and whether you see clients and all those sorts of things. It's going to change, but I think a good general rule, like I said with the interview, is to err on the side of being professional. If you'd fit in at the beach, you're probably not dressed appropriately for a law firm. This week, a Perth partner told me that she had to counsel a lawyer in her firm who wore white trousers with a black G-string, and she had to tell her that that was not appropriate for her to be wearing to work. So, that's probably not a good idea. But look at what others in the firm are wearing. Are they wearing full suits and ties? Even if they're not, it's probably a good idea to wear that on the first day so you can get a feel for what is expected of you. In some firms, the dress code is more relaxed for senior partners who would say that they've kind of earned the right to dress a bit more informally, but they expect the juniors to always be dressed formally. And so that means for men, long sleeves, not short sleeves, a tie, a proper jacket, and dress trousers. And shoes, make sure your shoes are clean, not scuffed. That's a pet hate of a few partners that I know. Make sure that you've got socks on. These things you might be smiling and smirking to yourselves, but these are things that I've had to talk to people about in the past. And for females, I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is shoes. This comment about shoes was in the boot camp for me on my day one, and I thought, what are you talking about? I can get away with wearing heels every day. I don't need to wear flat shoes, thank you. But this is what it's about, and it's if you need to run somewhere last minute, which may very well happen. If you've got a last minute court filing deadline and you need to run to court, or you need to run to a settlement, or you need to get somewhere from A to B and you need to do it quickly, you're probably going to need some flat shoes so that you can get yourself there very quickly. And you don't want the reason that you missed the filing deadline to be because you couldn't get there quick enough in your high heel shoes. So maybe it's a good idea to keep some flats at the office too. Now, in terms of introducing people, I was always taught that it's good to use full names, and I still think that that's a good idea for the first time that you meet someone new. So you'll notice when I introduce myself to somebody new, I'll say, "Hi, I'm Lucy Dickens." And if you listen to my podcast, you'll hear that every episode I start with, "Hi, I'm Lucy Dickens." There are lots of Lucys in the world, but not so many Lucy Dickens. So it helps people to recognize who it is that they're dealing with. Handshakes are really important. Now, this originally was going to be a session that we did in Perth, and I was going to get everybody to do a bit of a handshake experiment. But now COVID has banned handshakes, so no one will be doing that for a while. But when we are allowed to do it again, you need to make sure that you get your handshake right. So that is that you shake hands with your right hand, and you want a firm grip when you're doing a handshake. You don't want to be too weak and you don't want to be too strong, but a nice firm grip. And that really portrays confidence. If you're a bit nervous about meeting a client and you meet them with a really weak, kind of nervous handshake, they're going to see that. They're going to be able to tell that you're maybe not feeling quite as confident there. Introducing colleagues and clients is another thing that people often don't know how to do. So if you're in a meeting room with a client and you need to bring in a colleague, or even vice versa, you're with a colleague and you need to bring in a client, how do you go about doing that? How do you introduce one to the other? Well, like I said before, it's always a good idea to start with full names. So I might say to the client as they walk through the door, "This is my colleague, Michael Hodgkins. Michael, this is Patricia and Patrick Smith." And so everybody knows who everybody is. Don't just tell Michael your client's name, or just tell your clients your colleague's name, because one person will know who the other is, but the other won't know who the other is. So you need to say the names of everybody in the room and introduce them appropriately. There's nothing more awkward than coming into a room where there are people already in the room and already in a meeting, assuming it hasn't started, because if everybody's just waiting there and expecting an introduction and not receiving one, it's really quite awkward. So don't leave your clients and colleagues in the position of feeling awkward. And what will really stand you in good stead is to anticipate needs. Remember what I said about trying to make yourselves useful. So prepare meeting rooms in advance, get physical files ready before you're heading off to court or into a meeting. Be as organized as you can. Always have pens, always have business cards, always, always, always have your file note and a pen ready to write down anything that you need to record. And another real common question is, how long should this take me? And this is especially, I guess, on your mind when you're working in a firm that is asking you to record time, which will probably be the majority of the firms that you're in, and that they're charging the client for the time. Often you'll be thinking, well, what's fair, what's appropriate, how long should this take me? And obviously how long it should take you is going to depend on the piece of work that you're doing. So there's no hard and fast rule there. But the advice that I will give you is, if you don't know, then ask. How long do you expect that I should spend on this? And then when you've asked the question and you get started on the work, record all your time. Record it accurately. If the expectation is that this will take you 20 minutes and it takes you an hour, record an hour. Don't record 20 minutes. Let your supervisor be the one to determine how much, if any, time that they want to write down and not charge the client. That's not your call. Your job is to make sure that you're recording your time and recording it accurately. For your conduct, I think a lot of it comes down to your reputation. And so when it comes to your role and the way that you conduct yourself, a good reputation is far more valuable than money. And when you're starting your career and you're building your career, it's really important to work on your reputation. And that is something that you have control of. So be aware of these things, be aware of how you conduct yourself, and be aware of what value you're providing, and work on really building your reputation. Okay, number 4, communication. How should I address clients is probably just one of the many questions that you have about how to communicate in a law firm. Now, communicating between friends at uni is a very, very different thing to communicating with colleagues, clients, and courts. And in fact, communicating with each of those categories within themselves are going to be different too. One of the most common complaints from law firms is that juniors either don't communicate at all, they shut themselves off, or if they do, they're too informal. So let's have a look at some different types of communication and help give you some tips and strategies for how to communicate. And I'm going to start with the telephone. If the phone rings, you should answer it. And again, that one might sound like an obvious one, but it can be quite nerve-wracking to pick up the phone in a law firm when you don't really know if you're going to know the answers to the question that the person on the other side of the phone line has. That's quite nerve-wracking, and I get it. But you need to push past that fear and you need to pick up the phone. If the phone rings, answer it. I had a law clerk recently at our firm who never answered the phone. And I found out after she left our employment that she would let the phone ring, she'd let it go to voicemail, and then she would get on email and type an email to the client, and she almost would never pick up the phone. And the reason was because she didn't know what to say if she didn't know the answer to a question. I'm going to come to that in a minute. But use the phone. The phone is often much, much easier and quicker than email or SMS or any other way that you might communicate with people in your lives. You don't have to wait for a reply if you send an email. You don't have to spend half an hour working out whether you've used the right words and have you spell checked it correctly. You can just pick up the phone and have a human-to-human conversation. In terms of how to answer the phone, that's another one that you might ask yourself when you start in a law firm. Probably not appropriate to just pick up and say hello. You might want something that gives a bit more context than that. Again, my tip here would be to pay attention to how people around you answer the phone. When I started in my firm, most people answered the phone by saying their full name. So it would be ring, 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 and they'd say, Lucy Dickens. And so that's what I adopted for the first little while when I started at the firm. But I never really felt comfortable with it because it always just felt a bit odd to me. I wanted to have a greeting in there. So these days I answer the phone again using my full name so they know who's on the other side of the call, but I'll say something like, hello, welcome to Birmingham Ride. You're speaking to Lucy Dickens. How can I help you? Something a bit more polite. And I know that takes longer to say, but it gives a better impression for the person on the other side of the phone. So when you answer the phone, always announce who you are so the person who has called knows who they have come through to. Written correspondence. Now, we all finish uni thinking that we are experts at writing, and I'm no exception to that rule. I definitely thought I was an expert at writing. And we've all written hundreds of exam papers and assignments over the years that we've spent at uni. But writing in practice is very, very different to writing an exam. So where do you start? What do you do? Well, the first thing I'd suggest is that you find out if your firm has a style guide or a house style that sets out their rules for how to communicate. And if they do, it might be limited to how to format correspondence or documents, or it might go further to say things like whether you do or don't use contractions and how do you address your clients. Do you call them Dear Mr. Smith or do you say Dear John? If there is a style guide, find it, get your hands on it and read it. Make sure you understand it. And that's going to be the starting point for the firm that you're in. But I guess more generally, in terms of addressing correspondence, probably hey dude or hey mate is probably a bit too informal, particularly if you're speaking to a client that you don't know and you've not met before. The same with shortening names as well. If your client is a Michael, don't start calling him Mike unless perhaps he says, I prefer to be called Mike, by which case go for it. But don't make up nicknames for people. We really need to kind of stick to that level of professionalism, which means that when you're addressing people for the first time, particularly clients, you want to use their salutation, dear Mrs. Paul, or whatever it may be. And then check when first names are appropriate. Now, having said that, you may be in a firm that wants you to use first names, in which case ask them. But I think if you don't know, it's better to err on the side of caution once again and stick to that level of professionalism. Another really important thing to know about correspondence is to check the detail. There was more than one occasion when I was a junior where I took something to a partner to be settled and had to sit there with an embarrassed face as they fixed really minor typos where I just hadn't spent the time to proofread properly. And that's really embarrassing because you're wasting their time effectively, and they think she can't even proofread her own work. So proofread, and then do it again. And the best strategy I have for proofreading is to put some space and some time between you and the document that you've prepared. So always wait. So print it off if you can, or look at it on a different screen to the one that you've prepared it on. Wait, if you can wait, depending on the complexity of the document. If you can wait overnight, brilliant. If not, go and make a cup of tea, or just put some space between you and what it is that you've done, and then proofread it again. And I always notice a difference when I print, wait, and proofread than when I just have a quick skim over something on the computer. You never want to give something to a supervisor until you have proofread it yourself. Good writing is not a natural gift. We really do have to learn how to write well. And the way we're taught to write at school and university is not really the way that we write when we write in practice. At my bootcamp, I was given a version of this guide, How to Write Better. And I still have it. I have it on my desk. I refer to it quite often. It was the David Ogilvy, who is known as the father of advertising. And these on the slide that you can see are his top tips for how to write better. And these were, where were these? 1981, but they do still apply today. Just give you a minute to have a look at those. I've extracted some of my own top tips, and before I say that, if you can get your hands on this guide, have a look for it online. There's a lot of really helpful information there about how to write better, and lots of examples that touch on the 10 tips that are on this slide that you can see here. Some of my favourite tips are firstly to tailor your writing to the reader. So write for the person who you're talking to. I practice in wills and estate planning, and I'm often trying to describe quite complex legal concepts to my clients. And it's really important that I don't get caught up in the legalese, and that I instead write in language that they understand. And often that means really simplifying the words that we use, not using the fancy Latin that you might have learned at uni, and using the plain English equivalent for the purposes of making correspondence that somebody else can actually understand. Be human and be personal. Write as if you would talk, not literally, but metaphorically speaking. I mean, if you were to transcribe this conversation, my sentence structure would be all out, and you wouldn't quite want to put that straight into writing. But what I mean by that is use the kind of language that you would use when you're speaking to somebody. Be concise. Don't use any more words than you really, really need, and proofreading will help with that. Like I said, say what you think in simple sentences, and formatting is really important as well. Make sure that your documents look decent. So when you finish your document, make sure that the paragraph spacing between all the paragraphs is consistent. Make sure you've used the same font and the same font size throughout the whole document, and that you don't have random tabs or indents in paragraphs, in some paragraphs and not in others. It's frustrating to a supervisor when they not only have to fix your typos, but they also have to fix your formatting. So make sure that your documents look visually attractive. This one has a slide of its own because this is really important, and that is to use active verbs, not passive. Now, passive, people think that passive means past tense, but it doesn't. Passive actually means that something is being done to something else, instead of that something doing the action on its own. And if you can just change your writing from passive to active, you're going to make a massive difference to the way that your writing reads. Now, here's an example of that. In the passive tense, in the passive voice, we would say, we are concerned that if this recommendation is turned down, the brand's market share may be negatively affected. If we were to rewrite that sentence in active, you must act on this recommendation to hold the brand's share. It's much more direct, it's much clearer, it's much easier to understand, and it's shorter. So when you're proofreading your work, look for anything that's written in passive and see if you can change it to active. And avoid jargon. I just gave the example about Latin that sometimes is not appropriate to use in, for example, correspondence with your clients. But avoid jargon. Eliminate said. Eliminate re where you've got re on your subject line. It doesn't add anything. It doesn't mean anything. You can also eliminate other redundant words like in my opinion, da 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 da, or it is believed that da 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 da. Those words are redundant in the context. I mean, of course, it's your opinion. If you're writing a letter from you, who else's opinion would it be? So really need to take time to look at your writing and really examine it in a whole new way. And this was a big deal for me when I came out of university and I started in my career. I thought I was an excellent writer. And these days I'll say that I'm not. And I'm quite happy to say that I'm not. It's always a work in progress. We can always improve. And you may have heard this quote, I apologize for writing a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one, because it really does take more time to write a really concise and accurate piece than it does to just write a long ramble. All right, we're getting through. So let's go to number 5 of 7 steps in my bootcamp. And here I want to talk to you about clients. Skills for managing expectations are one of the best things that you can do for yourselves. The better you can manage expectations of others and expectations of yourself, the more calm and in control you'll feel. So what will clients expect of you? Again, this is going to depend on the type of work you're doing, the practice area, the type of firm, where you are, all those kinds of things. But I can give you some general comments about clients that will stand you in good stead and help to get you started. So let's go with the basics. First, who is your client? This is probably potentially one that you haven't thought about before. Who is it that you act for? Who does your firm act for? This is especially important where you're acting for, your client might be a husband, but you're receiving instructions or you keep getting phone calls from their wife. Do you have authority to take instructions from the wife? She's not your client. Do you have authority to give information to the wife if she's not your client? Who is your client? If you're dealing with a company, so a proprietary limited company or a trust, who can you take instructions from in that case? Do you need to deal with the director? Are you dealing with the director or are you dealing with somebody else? Who is the trustee, and do you have authority to liaise with somebody else if that person's not your client? So ask yourself, who is my client? Who am I working for? And make sure you ID them. Now, some of this, and in fact all of these steps, may have been completed for you by somebody else, but sooner or later, at one point or another, you're going to have your own clients and these are going to be your job. So is there a cost agreement? Now, a cost agreement sets out what you will be paid, how you will be paid, and all types of things like an hourly rate if you're charging on an hourly basis, how often you can bill, how frequently you can send a bill, who can charge on the matter, what rate they charge, all those kinds of things. All work needs a cost agreement, And certain costs disclosure is also required to, you're also required to give. Did you see me fix my passive to active? You are also required to give certain disclosure to all clients when they engage you as your practitioner. So if you're asked to do a piece of work, don't do it until you've got a cost agreement in place, and make sure there is one. When you then go on to do the work, make sure that the work you're doing is within the scope of the service that you've been engaged to provide. And that one's especially important if you're working in a firm that charges a fixed price for the work that they do. They will lose out if you then go and offer all these other types of services within a fixed price scope that doesn't cover the work that you then go on to do. So is this work within the scope? And look, I'm not necessarily saying you need to have all the answers to these questions. I'm saying you need to be aware of these questions so that you can go and find out the answers, or you know who to ask, and you don't kind of get yourself into trouble by going down rabbit holes that you shouldn't be going down. And of course, are you competent to give the advice? In terms of customers, I'm just checking these questions, but I'm going to stick to what I said at the beginning, and I'll come back to them at the end. The customer is always right. This is what I was taught, at least in retail or hospitality, and maybe you've been taught this too. But is this the case in law? Is the customer or the client always right? And my answer to that is that actually the answer is no. In law, the customer is not always right. And that can be one of the real big challenges, particularly if you've come from a retail or a hospitality background, or somewhere where you have been taught that the customer is always right. They're not in law. Sometimes clients will ask you to do something that's legally incorrect, or something that you disagree with, something that's beyond the scope of your service, or something that's going to get you into trouble. And you need to have ways of saying no to a client who is paying your bill, and that can be really challenging. Learning skills for managing clients and how to say no, and how to recognize that actually sometimes you need to say, that's not right, we need to do it this way. And having the confidence and the conviction to do that is a really big learning curve for most people as they start their professional career. But I think it's important to understand that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have all the answers. What you need instead is to have the ability to say, I don't know, but I will find out. And to really get comfortable with saying, I don't know, but I will find out. And the day that I learned this, or that I had this realization myself, was a real turning point for me in my career. And I still remember it. I was in a meeting with my boss and with two clients. It was the four of us in the meeting. And they were asking him these really complicated questions that, let's be honest, were going straight over my head. I had no idea. But they thought that they were really simple. And you might find that often clients want things to be simple, and unfortunately they're not always. But I watched as my boss, who was an experienced practitioner, quite confidently say to these clients, I don't know, but I'll find out. And it was that made me realize that if my supervisor, who was 25 odd years experienced practitioner, if he didn't have to have all the answers, I don't have to have them all either. And that what's far more important than having the answer, and what's definitely more important than trying to guess and potentially getting it wrong and getting yourself into a whole lot of trouble, is to learn how to confidently say, I don't know, but I will find out. So practice it. Other points to note in terms of managing client expectations is to make sure you give realistic timeframes for any work that you say that you will complete or that you're asked to complete. Always explain the process or the next steps to your clients, and this is really helpful as you start to get busier and your workload starts to increase and you're managing lots of different competing priorities. To be able to say to your client that thank you for your instructions, I've received your email, I'm going to prepare your document and I'll get it back to you by the end of the week. By doing that, you're going to save yourself from lots of phone calls from lots of different clients, just following up or just asking a question or just seeing, when can I expect to hear from you? You take charge of that, and then you get to do the work on your terms and within your schedule of priorities. And that is a really powerful thing for you to comprehend and for you to understand. And when you put something like that into practice and you take charge of managing your clients' expectations in that way, they feel like you've got this. They can put trust in you because they feel that you know what you're doing and that they can rely on you. So the key is to set realistic customer expectations, and then not just to meet them, but to exceed them, preferably in unexpected and helpful ways. It comes back to what I said about finding ways to make yourself useful, not just for your employers and for your supervisors, but for your clients too. Okay, supervisors, how do you make a good impression? How do you not feel or look like a fool? Because I know that you want to impress, but you're probably also painfully aware, especially after hearing me today, maybe, that really you have no idea of the way things are done, and that you want to try and make yourself useful, but at the same time, you don't want to be annoying, and you really want to grow in your career and excel in your career, and you really want to make a good go of this. So how do you make a good impression? Well, let's share some tips about how to work with your supervisor as the starting point. And I've used supervisor here because the person who you're reporting to may or may not be a partner. So you might be reporting directly to a partner or a managing partner, an equity partner, a lawyer. You might be reporting to a paralegal. Whoever you're reporting to is your supervisor. And start by working out how they like to supervise. Do they like to settle your documents in person? Do they like you to email them? Do they like to have a phone chat, perhaps if they're working remotely? Do they like regular scheduled meetings, or are they happy to give you ad hoc advice anytime you knock on the door? Do they have an open door policy, or do you need to go and see them within a certain period of the day? Work that out first, and then you're going to set yourself up for success. Work out how they like to supervise, how they like to work with you. And if you need to ask them the question, then ask them. Now, when you do go to them with work that you've got to settle, don't just bring a question, always bring a proposed answer or solution. And this is a little bit like your job application in the very beginning. You want to show that you've put some effort into this and you're not just outsourcing the problem or delegating the problem, making it somebody else's problem. It makes a really big difference to the willingness to help and the kind of response and the attitude that you get back from the person that you are being supervised by, if they can see that you have given it time and thought yourself. Always allow time for supervision, and don't let your poor time management or your client pressures become somebody else's problem. It still happens for me that I get people bring me work that they have sat on for, say, 2 weeks, and they've promised the client that they're going to have it today, and now all of a sudden it's my problem and I need to deal with it today because they've promised the client that they could have it and they've done nothing with it for 2 weeks. And that's really, really annoying. So don't be that person. If you've set the time frame, or your clients have, or your supervisor has, that this needs to be done by this time, always allow time within that period for supervision. And taking notes here is a really good way to make sure that you do that, and to look back and refresh your memory and allow time for all of the questions that you might have. I came across this list of 9 tips for getting clear directions, and this came from a Simon Tutman white paper called The Motivation Imperative. And I thought this was really, really useful to share with you. So I've copied his 9 points here, and I've got the source listed there so you can go and access it directly. But he has these 9 points here for getting directions, and that covers things like, how much time do you expect me to spend on it? Is this a priority? When should it be completed? Where else can I get information or help? And that's really good, especially if you're kind of feel like you might be drowning and you don't want to delegate or outsource the problem. You really want to have a good go at it, but perhaps you just need some direction about where to look. When do you want me to get back to you? And then let me see if I have things clear. here's what I intend to do. Is that right? And I really like that last question. I think that's really, really helpful to kind of summarize and make sure that you're on the same page. Now, I'm not suggesting that you take this list of 9 questions and you use it as your checklist for every time you're given a piece of work to do, but it gives you a good idea for the kinds of things you need to have clear in your own mind. And perhaps a couple of the questions will come in handy for you now and then. My last point on managing your clients is to remember that it's your practicing certificate on the line here, or your future practicing certificate. And that really means that the buck stops with you. Make sure that you understand and you're happy with everything that you put your name to. And that's really important. If you don't, keep learning, keep researching, keep asking for help until you get to the point where you understand it and you're happy with it. Okay, and last but not least, before we move into some questions, let's talk about self. Because you do need to look after yourself. Law is a stressful profession, and you will need to learn techniques for coping with stress, for coping with anxiety, for switching off when you leave the office. That was a really big one for me, and still is sometimes. How do I stop thinking about work so that I can think about something else, or so that I can just relax, or so I can just watch Netflix, whatever it might be? Early on in my career, in fact, during my practical legal training, I came across this article. The source is there at the bottom. It's Practicing Professionalism. And it's an article that summarizes research about the cultivation of a professional identity. And the way the research is done is by looking at the real life experience of entry-level lawyers. The article talks really usefully about the internal challenges that you might struggle with as you transition from law student to legal practitioner. And it really helps to validate the experience. A lot of the questions that you might have that you feel that nobody else, that you don't know who to ask, or you don't know if you should ask, or the fears that you might have, the anxieties you might have, I really do think that by reading this article, you will recognize that you are not alone. It includes quotes from people just like you and me who have gone through this, and it's really, really relatable. But the summary is that it recognises these 3 factors that really help to influence a sense of professional identity. The first is the balance between independent work and close mentoring and supervision. Because no matter how much help we provide you as supervisors, you do still have to deal with these issues independently. You are the one that has to pick up the phone. As much as I'm telling you it's okay, learn how to say, I don't know, but I'll find out. You're still the one that has to pick up the phone. You're still the one that has to go and introduce yourself to the intimidating client. You still have to go through these things yourself. As part of that is the second factor that they recognise is the realisation that law practice involves ongoing certainty. It's not like law school where we can write an exam and we can say, well, it might be this, and I'm going to say for the purposes of the exam, I'm going to draw a conclusion and I'm going to go with option A. Legal practice isn't quite as black and white, and the ability to manage that uncertainty doesn't come automatically. So we need to get comfortable with not knowing all the law. We need to get comfortable with not knowing the answers to all the questions. And we need to get comfortable with the fact that there is always going to be a level of uncertainty about the work we do. And as part of that, it's really, really important to avoid the temptation to fake it. There's a certain time and place for the fake it till you make it, but the time and place is not when you're giving legal advice. It's really, really important that you know what you're doing when it comes to giving legal advice. So don't fake that knowledge. If there is uncertainty, you need to do more research, you need to ask more questions, you need to get more help. And then the third one is the convergence between your values and the values modelled by the firm that you find yourself in. Because you might find yourself in situations where your personal values don't align with something that you've been asked to do. And you're going to have to work out what you're going to do in those scenarios, and how would you take a more objective viewpoint with a client who may have some circumstances that you don't necessarily agree with. How will you learn when it is appropriate or inappropriate, or whether it's appropriate or inappropriate to make moral judgments about your clients. Those are the kind of, I guess, big picture concepts that come with this transition, this journey to becoming a legal professional. And I really enjoyed this article, and I recommend that you go and have a look at it, because I think it really does help to validate some of those experiences. So in terms of taking care of yourself, time management is absolutely my biggest tip. And that really is a whole session in itself in terms of how to manage your workload, how to manage expectations of clients and supervisors. But if I had to nut it down to just one tip, it would be to be proactive about how you spend your time. Don't respond to your inbox. Don't respond to other people's who are trying to dictate your priorities. You need to take control and take responsibility for how you spend your time. So that means making a to-do list for tomorrow at the end of each day and doing the hard work, not putting it off because it's difficult. Be prepared, the Scouts motto, and that really will help you with your career. The better prepared you are for everything, whether it's a meeting with a client, whether it's going to court, whether it's a team meeting, or even just a document review, the better prepared you are, the better you will perform. Get to know what helps you switch off, and eat well, exercise, get enough sleep. You've heard all these things before. I shared this on LinkedIn yesterday because it came up in my feed, and I thought it really is accurate. We think that hard work is going to be enough, but it's not. Exercise, healthy eating, sleep, time off, spending time with family, doing other things that are important to you really tie into that bigger picture. So self-care is a priority and a necessity. It's not a luxury in the work that we do. So those are the 7 elements that I wanted to talk to you about. So we've spoken about your job application, what it looks like inside a law firm, at least what the hierarchy might be. What's your role? Some tips about communications and managing clients. Number 6 was supervisors and how to work with them, how to make yourself useful. And then we finished on yourself. How are you going to manage yourself throughout all this? I've got some top tips from your future supervisors that I'm just going to go through. And I'm just going to go through these slides quite quickly because I'm aware of the time and I want to get to some of the questions that are in the chat. But let me just quickly work my way through these. And if you want explanation, we can do that in the Q&A. So let me tell you that mistakes can be fixed if you tell a supervisor at the earliest opportunity. You don't know what you don't know, and what you don't know can hurt you. Don't guess, don't assume. Make sure you've done your research. Do not witness a signature that you didn't actually see get signed. Do not do that. Please don't do that. Learn techniques to confidently tell clients, I don't know, but I'll find out. Build a support network, both within and outside of your place of employment, and try and be connected with people who are in other firms and who are in the broader profession, not just within the walls of your firm. Ask for help and trust your gut. That's really important. It hasn't failed me yet. So my challenge to you, or my tasks for you, is that I think when we finish this webinar, write down the top 3 things that stood out for you. Writing things down helps to cement them in your memory. So write down the 3 things that really stood out for you that you want to remember. And before you go into your first or perhaps your next job in a law firm, watch this webinar again. The college are going to send you the link so you can watch it again and kind of remind yourself and help settle some of those feelings of overwhelm and anxiety, because you've got this. You will have this. And the last thing I'd like to ask from you is for you to tell me how you use this advice and what results you get. And I mean it, truly. Send me an email. My email address is on there, or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn, and I love seeing new perspectives and meeting and connecting with new people on there. But I would love to hear how you use this advice, and I'm more than willing to help you on your career journey with any tips if I can share them. So don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you can learn about all those law firms and some examples that I have shared with you. And now let's go to some questions and see what you've got. Now I know there's been a lot coming through on the chat and on the Q&A, and Michelle's going to help me work through them.
Yeah. So Lucy, I don't know if you want to work through the ones in the Q&A, and I've pulled out some from the chat, but you've got some broad categories. So some categories about getting an interview with no prior experience, some question about interview expectations, the lawyer hierarchy, roles and titles. There's quite a few questions about active and passive voice, and some about note taking.
Okay.
Some that I would say about building confidence as a new practitioner and dealing with difficult situations, and one about the billable hour. Yes.
All right. Okay, so I've got the Q&A open. Let's go with the interviews, right? Let's start there. So can you give me a summary of kind of the gist of the questions?
Yes, so the question is, what advice do you give if a firm you've taken a job with, or the job description itself is radically different from what you're presented with at interview?
Okay, what advice would you be? So this is, I'm assuming here that this is you've taken the job, so you've already started, they've represented themselves to be something that they're not, is what I'm assuming has happened there. My advice would be to give it some time, firstly, because there is a steep learning curve on day one in any new firm, regardless of where you're at in your career. And so give it some time to get used to the firm, to understand the role, to see what they expect of you, and to understand what the work is like. The work you do on day one, or the jobs, or whatever the role is that you're given on day one, is probably not going to be the same as the jobs that you're given on week 4, because we need some time to teach you the ropes and for you to learn to make yourself useful. So my honest answer would be, firstly, to give it some time. But then if you still decide that this is actually not what was promised to me in the interview, then I would have a conversation with your supervisor and say, this is what I was expecting. This is the work that I've actually been asked to do, and how can we fix this? This is not what I had thought that I had signed up for.
Great. And Lucy, there's a few questions about what do you do if you don't have experience in the legal industry? How do you sell yourself is one of the questions, and what do you put on your CV is related to the question.
Okay, great. And I actually had some questions before the session that were along similar lines to this as well. I have got a list of the people who sent me questions in advance, and this is some of them. So I always look for people who tell me about a job that they've had. And if we're talking about a graduate position, it doesn't have to be experience in the law. I'm looking for somebody who has put themselves out there and who has had a job while they studied, who has got themselves some real life experience. Customer service experience is fantastic experience to have. I understand, as I think most law firms would, that if you're applying for a graduate position, this is your first job. You might have done some work experience during uni, but this is the first job in a law firm. So we can't expect it both ways. If we're looking for a graduate, we need to understand that. So talk about the experiences that you've had. Talk about how you are very experienced at customer service, and how could we put that? What kind of skills would I be interested in? How are you going to sell yourself? Your professional manner with, I want to be careful here not to give you the type of words to use on your resume, because you don't just want to be a carbon copy of me, you obviously want to be yourselves. But I'd be talking about the kinds of skills that you learned at the job that you had, whatever it was, whether it was in law or otherwise, and how you think those can be relevant, bearing in mind that you're still dealing with humans, you're still dealing with people. Your written skills are obviously really important. Your common sense is really important. And if you can demonstrate that through your application, then that's going to stand you in good stead.
Thanks, Lucy. And there's quite a few questions about how you recommend new practitioners build confidence in the workplace, how they deal with anxiety and difficult situations, for example, personality clashes, or a supervisor that doesn't want to teach them.
Yeah, that's tricky. And I know from speaking to lots of juniors that unfortunately it's more common than I would like it to be, in terms of supervisors who aren't giving the kind of supervision really that you need. So my starting point is, if you're not getting what you need from within the firm, look outside. And it's never too early to start building your professional network. So use places like LinkedIn, join groups, the young lawyers groups that are run by the law societies and others. Go to all your College of Law events and start meeting and networking with other people, so that your support network grows and that you've got people outside of your firm that you can lean on for support when you need it.
Great, thank you. There were also some questions just about, I know you've talked about getting support, but questions about how you might deal with those difficult situations and cultural fit.
Okay. Did anyone give any examples?
Not that I saw specifically, no, Lucy.
Okay. Well, no, it's tricky. It's tricky without examples, but I guess to some extent, we don't all have to be best friends. And the job that you're in today is not necessarily going to be the job that you're in forever. In fact, it's probably more than likely that it won't be. So look at what you can get out of it. And I'm not saying that you should allow people to disrespect you. You shouldn't. I mean, yes, stand up for yourself. But we don't all need to be best friends with our supervisors or with the managing partners. So what can you get out of the relationship? Perhaps it's that they have a really unusual manner. I mean, there's somebody who I've worked with in my career who will never say hello, will never ask you how you are, or kind of all those personal little things that you and I would probably do just don't exist. They're just non-existent, never to be asked. But he is an excellent lawyer, and I can learn a hell of a lot from him. So sometimes it's just recognizing that we have different personalities, and that actually that's okay.
Great, thank you, Lucy. There's a few questions about lawyer hierarchy and roles and titles.
Yep.
Some of them have been answered in the chat, but I just thought if you could answer some of these. What's the difference between a graduate lawyer and an associate and a lawyer?
Depends where you work. And that, I can see a question here about job titles here in the Q&A, but different firms use different titles. Whether you're a graduate lawyer or an associate or a senior associate, you're still a legal practitioner. It's just where you sit in the hierarchy, and not all firms use this terminology. A graduate lawyer is obviously somebody who's just recently graduated. A senior associate is a lawyer, but somebody who has a bit more experience. And there's no hard and fast rules about how many years of experience you need for those different positions. But that's all they are. They're just different ways of saying that somebody is a legal practitioner, and used by firms who want to demonstrate some sort of hierarchy.
And you may have seen this question in the Q&A. As a newly admitted lawyer in Victoria who's still in the initial 2 years of supervision, are there any rules around job title to express this? Can you just be called lawyer, or do you need to express lawyer supervised? I did have a look on the Victorian Legal Services Board website for that one, and I think that's what we'd recommend. You contact your local regulator so that you're really sure. But there's nothing in relation to that. I suspect in most states it seems to be that being called lawyer is sufficient once you've been admitted.
Yeah, I agree. That's the case in WA, but check in Victoria is what I can suggest as well.
There were some questions around around active and passive voice. So just a clarifying question. Sorry, this is just about writing generally. Were you saying get rid of re in the subject header lines in letters?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Great. And is verbatim appropriate for note taking, or is a Cornell note sufficient with the columns?
Again, I say it needs to be an accurate record of what happens in the meeting, and it needs to be something that somebody else can understand. So notes are fine. You won't be able to write word for word every conversation, but you need, there are some words that you might think that's really important. I'm going to write that phrase. Again, it's kind of hard, it's a bit hard to say, but what I would suggest is that you go and have a look at some file notes. Have a look at the way other people have written the file notes and the kinds of things that they record. But you definitely don't need to write word for word. Note taking is fine.
Great. And Kim has asked, how would you manage potential risks in communication where the active version may have legal implications? For example, the use of modals such as will or should, etc., in cases where an active sentence points to or suggests that the person is liable for something.
I'm reading that one here as well. I'm just seeing if I follow. Use of modals will or should. Active sentence points to. Okay, I'm not entirely sure I quite follow what you're asking there, Kim, except to say that if the use of the active or passive is going to change the legal meaning of the sentence and it's not the legal meaning that you want, then don't use it. You know, these are all suggestions. None of these are rules. They're rules for making correspondence. Sorry, they're suggestions for making your correspondence sound better, but there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to writing. So you need to consider each circumstance itself.
And Hadia has asked, what would you say about how legislation is written? Is that in the active or passive voice?
I don't know. Again, it's going to depend on which act you're looking at. I'd say the more modern ones would hopefully tend to have more of the active voice, but there's some legislation that's very, very old and still uses language that we wouldn't even use today. Yeah.
And Lucy, unrelated to writing now,
Yeah.
Can an admitted lawyer apply for lower positions such as law clerk, paralegal, legal assistant?
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing stopping you from making the application. I think what's important to know or to understand there, and this is the position in WA, I expect it would be the same in other states as well, is that if you are an admitted practitioner, in order for a law firm to employ you in a role that is not as a legal practitioner, they have to get approval from the relevant practice board. So that may be, in some cases, a barrier to them actually offering you that employment if they can't get the approval. Again, like I said, that's the position in WA. I would imagine there would be similar rules in other states, but there's definitely nothing stopping you from applying. I would be, and often a lot of those roles that are the clerk, paralegal, legal assistant lead to people being employed as a lawyer and, you know, the other career progression. But I would set out in your application why you're applying for that position, even though you would appear to be overqualified.
There's some questions about billing. So do law firms generally offer training on how to charge clients?
I would have thought so. If part of your role is to charge clients, then yes. I still stick to what I said, which is if you're charging for time, record everything and let your supervisor help you work out what to write down and what can actually be charged on to the client. And as part of that process, then they're going to teach you how to do that for yourself when the time comes.
And do you have any strategies for getting on top of the billable hour, Lucy?
Getting on top of, what do you think is meant by that? Is there any other context?
No.
Does it mean making sure we record or get all the hours in, maybe?
Maybe, or it could be just managing the requirement to bill a certain number of hours in a day.
Okay, sure. So my comments on that would be, firstly, to record accurately, because if you record your time and you think, oh, that should only have taken me an hour, but I spent 2 hours on it, well, you've just lost yourself an hour of your billable time. And we're looking at, in your case, what's important is the time that you record, not necessarily the time that then gets billed to the client. So I think the starting point is to make sure that you're recording your time accurately to start with. And then it would come down to things like time management and how you're spending your time. So making sure that you are, let me think of some practical examples. One of the things that I tell my staff is to make sure you do all the work on one file in one go. So if you've got a file where you need to fill in, say, 3 or 4 different application documents, dedicate a chunk of time to doing all that in one go rather than doing it piecemeal. Because if you do 10 minutes on this and then you move to something else, you're losing out on a whole chunk of time in between there where you're switching between tasks. And that's time that's just wasted.
There are a lot of other questions that have come in. I don't know that Lucy's going to have a chance to answer everything, so we're trying to get across some of the areas. Lucy, I know you said you had some questions on notice. Are there any that you wanted to cover in?
I had a couple of questions from people who said that they were mature. I'm just looking here at what I've got written down. Who said that they were mature age and they were getting started with their career in law. So I know there are a few people on the webinar here who might be in that category. And the questions were along the lines of, is this perceived as a strength or a liability? And how can I use that to my advantage? And my comments on that would be, to me, I'm interested in the person who's sitting in front of me and what skills they can bring to the table. I'm not interested in whether you're 30 or 40 or 21. I'm interested in who you are and what your background is. So use your prior experience to your advantage, and don't try and hide the fact that you had a job for 5 years as a medical receptionist. Use that to your advantage and explain in your application how your job history can help you with the application that you've got in place now. I don't perceive it as your age to be a liability. I think that in some cases, showing maturity or showing that you know what you want out of your career can actually be a real strength.
Great. There are some questions around supervision. What if you aren't being given adequate supervision? And also, is it okay to ask your supervisor clarifying questions? I'm just trying to find more on that.
That's okay. Yes, ask clarifying questions. Make sure you've thought it through, actually take the time to reflect on what they've said to you before you dive in with the questions. But yes, you should ask questions if you don't understand something. And what do we do if we're not adequately supervised? Well, what do we do there? I'd start by taking it up with your supervisor. So explain that you feel like you need a bit more support than what they have offered you, and explain why. So this is what we've discussed, and this is where I'm still struggling. Can you offer me some more help with this? And if that doesn't work, then I'd look for other people within the firm who you can have that conversation with. So whether that's some other person who is supervising you, perhaps even a peer, maybe it's not a partner, but somebody else, maybe a lawyer, looking at that hierarchy. You don't have to jump right to the top. Who else within the team can you look to for some help and support, or might be able to give you some strategies for working with your supervisor?
Lucy, what are your thoughts on cold emailing firms with a solid CV and cover letter?
Sometimes that works. It's going to depend. If they're looking for someone and you happen to land in their inbox at the right time, then great, brilliant, good on you. And I think in our firm, we've hired people on that basis in the past. But I would say the same as what I said with making your initial application. Apply for the job, apply to the firm. Don't just send them a generic, I'd really like to work for you, I think that your business is amazing, when you don't actually say that you really understand what their business does. So if you want to do that, do so, but make sure you're speaking directly to the firm that you're sending the email to.
There's a question as to whether you have any advice for taking notes when a person has a physical disability that prevents them from handwriting. Is it possible to take file notes electronically?
I'm sure it would be. If you have a physical disability that's stopping you, absolutely. Yep.
And Lucy, how important do you think LinkedIn is, especially if you don't have social media?
I really like LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn quite often. I didn't used to. It's probably only within the last couple of years that I've really started to engage with LinkedIn. I think one of the reasons why I like it is that it builds that sense of professional community that's broader than the firm that you're in. And I think that's something that's really important, because each firm does things slightly differently, and it's always really good to have different perspectives on the way things work from different places. But you know, I'm not saying it's make or break. You go on there and check it out would be what I'd say. Have a look, form some connections, share a few posts and comment on a few other people's things and see if you like it. And if you don't, I'm not saying you have to use it, but I find it to be a really useful tool.
Thank you, Lucy. We've come to the end of the session. Thank you so much for that informative session and managing all of those questions as you went. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, and sorry that we couldn't do that in the time, but Lucy did get to a large portion of them. So thank you so much, Lucy. I can see a lot of thanks coming to you through the chat. Very, very greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Stay in touch.
Oh, it's nice seeing all these thank yous come through. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. And yeah, like Michelle said, stay in touch. I'd be happy to connect with you on LinkedIn if you go and check it out.
Great. Oh, that really does make you feel warm and fuzzy, doesn't it, Lucy, seeing all those thank yous flying in?
Especially because I can't see anyone's faces. I'm just looking at my own face. So yes, it's lovely. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Cool.
Okay, I can see people are signing out now. We will end the broadcast shortly. Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks, Michelle.
Bye.